The sun dips low over the bustling streets of Istanbul, casting long golden shadows across the ornate domes and winding alleyways. The scent of spices drifts softly through the air, mingling with the distant murmur of merchants and the gentle ripple of water along the Bosphorus. Tonight, we take a quiet journey back in time. Welcome, friends, to a story of a world both magnificent and merciless, the Ottoman Empire. Imagine navigating crowded markets, obeying strict laws, and facing challenges that tested every skill, every nerve. Behind the grandeur of palaces and colourful silks, life could be harsh, strange, and full of surprises you'd never expect. Did you know that even a small mistake could carry severe consequences, or that daily routines were often far more grueling than we might imagine today? As we wander together through this distant past, let your mind drift gently, letting the sights, sounds, and secrets of the empire unfold around you. If you enjoy exploring these quiet corners of history, feel free to like, subscribe, or leave a small note in the comments. It's always lovely to hear from you, and before we begin, I'd love to know, where are you listening from tonight, and what time is it for you right now? The Ottoman Empire, founded around 1299 by Osman IV, grew to become one of the longest-lasting and most powerful empires in world history. At its peak, it stretched across 3 continents, covering much of southeastern Europe, Western Asia, and North Africa. The empire was known not only for its impressive architecture, trade networks, and cultural achievements, but also for its highly organised administrative and legal system. Governance in such a vast and diverse territory required strict laws to maintain order, and the Ottoman rulers were determined to ensure that justice was swift and effective. Citizens, soldiers, merchants, and even nobles lived under a legal framework designed to keep rebellion, crime, and disorder at bay. Understanding this context helps explain why life in the Ottoman Empire could be unforgiving for anyone who broke the rules. In the Ottoman Empire, breaking the law could have consequences that were both immediate and severe. The legal system combined Islamic Sharia law with Qanun, a set of secular laws issued by the Sultan. This dual system meant that the authorities had considerable flexibility to punish crimes in a way that maintained public order. Theft, for example, was not treated lightly. Depending on the severity of the offence and the social status of the offender, punishments could include public floggings, amputation of hands, or even execution. These punishments were often carried out in public spaces such as marketplaces or town squares, both to penalise the offender and to serve as a stark warning to the rest of the community. The public nature of punishment reinforced the idea that law-breaking would have immediate consequences. Murder was viewed as an even graver offence. Families of victims often had the right to seek retribution under certain interpretations of the law, while the state could also step in to punish the offender. Methods of execution could vary, ranging from hanging and beheading to other forms of capital punishment. The swift response was intended to prevent cycles of revenge that could destabilise neighbourhoods or entire regions. In many ways, the Ottoman legal system was proactive. By demonstrating that crime was met with immediate and often severe consequences, rulers aimed to deter others from committing similar offences. Citizens lived with the constant awareness that a single act of violence could change their lives forever. Rebellion against the Sultan or local authorities was considered an especially dangerous crime. The empire relied on strict loyalty from its subjects, especially in strategically important regions. Any sign of insubordination or revolt could provoke extreme punishment, including execution or exile. For example, provincial governors or military commanders suspected of challenging the Sultan's authority could be swiftly removed or eliminated to prevent the spread of dissent. These measures were a reminder that the stability of the empire depended on absolute obedience, and even those in positions of power were not immune to the law. Rebellions, no matter how small, were treated as threats to the empire's very foundation, and the response was often both public and brutal to discourage others. The severity and immediacy of punishment extended beyond the physical consequences. Social reputation and family honour were also at stake. Being publicly punished for theft, murder or rebellion could bring shame not only on the individual but also on their entire family. This social pressure acted as an additional deterrent, reinforcing compliance with the law. It was a system designed to leave no ambiguity. Committing a crime was dangerous in every sense, physically, socially, and politically. In short, Living under Ottoman rule meant understanding that crime carried serious consequences. Theft, murder, or rebellion could be met with punishments so immediate and severe that they were impossible to ignore. This uncompromising approach helped maintain order across the empire's vast territories, but it also created a society in which fear of the law was an ever-present reality. Citizens learned quickly that disobedience could lead to instant life-altering consequences, a reality that would make it difficult for anyone unfamiliar with the empire's strict legal culture to survive even a single day without fear. In the vast and diverse Ottoman Empire, maintaining order across sprawling cities, towns, and rural villages required more than just strict laws. It demanded visible enforcement. The Ottomans understood the psychological power of public punishments, which served as a method not only to penalise the guilty, but also to warn the general population of the consequences of law-breaking. In an age without mass media or modern policing systems, public punishment was the most effective way to communicate the authority of the state. The mere sight of an offender being punished could influence the behaviour of hundreds, sometimes thousands of citizens, reinforcing the idea that the law was both powerful and unyielding. Public punishments took many forms, ranging from floggings and stocks to more extreme measures like amputation or execution. Marketplaces, town squares, and prominent streets often became stages for these displays, ensuring maximum visibility. For example, thieves might have their hands or feet amputated in front of a crowd, while rebellious individuals could be publicly beheaded. These punishments were meticulously carried out according to legal procedures, with religious or civil authorities supervising to ensure legitimacy. By making punishment a public spectacle, the empire reinforced the notion that crime would not only be punished but humiliated, striking fear into both the offender and onlookers. The Ottoman rulers were strategic in using these punishments to maintain social order. They recognized that fear could be a powerful tool for compliance. When citizens witnessed justice being administered in a dramatic public manner, it created a psychological deterrent that laws alone could not achieve. Ordinary people, knowing that even minor crimes could result in public humiliation or bodily harm, were often cautious in their actions. Parents would warn their children, and communities would self-police to avoid attracting the attention of authorities. In this way, public punishments helped the empire govern efficiently across vast territories with limited bureaucratic reach. Religious and moral considerations also played a role in these spectacles. Under Sharia law, certain crimes demanded corporal punishment as a form of moral correction, not just legal consequence. Executing justice publicly allowed citizens to see the law in action, reinforcing moral and social norms. Punishments were carefully designed to reflect the severity of the offence, sending a clear message. Minor theft might result in a beating or short imprisonment, whereas murder, rebellion, or acts against the Sultan could lead to public execution. This calibrated system of public consequences strengthened the perception of fairness and authority in the eyes of the population. However, the practice of public punishment had broader social implications. While it instilled fear and encouraged obedience, it also created a culture of anxiety and caution. Citizens were constantly aware that even small mistakes could result in public shame or physical harm. This fear extended to social interactions, trade, and even personal expression, as people were careful not to appear rebellious or disrespectful. In some cases, the spectacle of punishment reinforced hierarchical structures, reminding the lower classes of their vulnerability and dependence on the state's protection. Ultimately, public punishments were a cornerstone of Ottoman governance, blending legal authority with psychological strategy. By making examples of offenders, the empire maintained social stability across an immense and culturally diverse territory. While harsh and sometimes brutal by modern standards, these public punishments reflected a system where visibility and deterrence were critical tools for survival. For an outsider or newcomer, witnessing the consequences of disobedience firsthand would have been a sobering and terrifying lesson in the power and reach of Ottoman law. The Ottoman Empire's legal system was unique in its combination of religious Sharia law and secular state laws, known as Qanun. This dual legal framework allowed the empire to govern a vast, culturally diverse population efficiently, while maintaining centralized control. Sharia law, derived from Islamic principles, regulated personal behavior, morality, and criminal offences among Muslim citizens. Meanwhile, the Qanun, issued by the Sultan and his advisors, provided secular rules to address administrative, financial, and social issues that were not explicitly covered by religious law. The interplay between these two systems ensured that law enforcement was comprehensive, strict, and adaptable to different circumstances. Crimes like theft, murder, and rebellion fell under both Sharia and Qanun, depending on their nature, location, and the individuals involved. For example, murder might invoke Sharia procedures for compensation or retribution, while rebellion against the Sultan was addressed through the Qanun, emphasizing loyalty and political control. Judges, known as qadis, were trained in Sharia and could interpret religious law, while state officials ensured that Qanun regulations were followed. This dual enforcement system gave authorities broad discretion in punishing offenders, allowing them to combine moral, religious, and political considerations when meting out justice. Citizens were constantly reminded that their actions could be judged from multiple legal perspectives, heightening the sense of accountability. The enforcement of these combined laws was meticulous and highly organized. In urban centers such as Istanbul, Bursa, or Edirne, officials maintained detailed records of offences, fines, and punishments. They also coordinated with local police forces, military units, and religious authorities to ensure that justice was carried out promptly. In rural areas, enforcement relied on local governors and community leaders who reported criminal activity and carried out sentences according to both Sharia and Qanun guidelines. This decentralized yet coordinated system allowed the empire to govern effectively across thousands of miles, ensuring that lawbreakers could be punished even in distant provinces. One of the strengths of this legal duality was its flexibility. Religious law provided a moral framework and sense of divine justice, appealing to the deeply devout population. The Qanun, on the other hand, offered practical solutions for administrative challenges and issues that religion alone could not address. For instance, taxation disputes, land rights, and military service obligations were handled under Qanun regulations, while personal crimes like adultery or theft were guided by Sharia. By enforcing both systems simultaneously, the empire ensured that citizens understood the consequences of their actions not only in earthly terms but also within the moral and spiritual order of society. This comprehensive approach reinforced obedience and deterred potential lawbreakers. The consequences of violating these combined laws were often severe. A thief could face corporal punishment under Sharia, while a rebellious provincial governor could be removed or executed under Qanun. Public punishments, already discussed in the previous subheading, often reflected this dual enforcement. The moral weight of religious law combined with the political authority of the state made the consequences both frightening and unavoidable. Ordinary citizens quickly learned that compliance with the law was essential for survival, and even minor transgressions could attract attention from multiple authorities, creating a constant pressure to behave. Enforcement based on both religious and state laws also reinforced the empire's social hierarchy. Nobles and high-ranking officials were sometimes subject to more discreet forms of punishment, while commoners could face public, corporal consequences. Nevertheless, the overarching principle was clear. No one was above the law, whether the offence was religious, civil, or political. This combination of fairness, severity, and visibility made Ottoman justice a powerful tool for maintaining order across a vast, multicultural empire. In conclusion, the Ottoman legal system's integration of Sharia and Qanun ensured that justice was not only strict and immediate, but also morally and politically reinforced. Citizens lived under a framework where religion and state authority intertwined, creating an environment in which obedience was essential for survival. The fear of punishment, coupled with the awareness of moral and legal consequences, made life in the empire both disciplined and intimidating. Anyone unfamiliar with these laws would quickly realize that even minor offences could trigger severe responses, demonstrating why survival in the Ottoman Empire required both caution and respect for the law. Life in the Ottoman Empire was defined not only by strict laws and harsh punishments, but also by constant oversight from authorities. The empire's administrative system was highly organized, and one of its main priorities was to ensure the collection of taxes and proper management of resources. Taxes were essential to maintain the military, support public works, and fund the lavish lifestyle of the Sultan and the ruling elite. To achieve this, officials closely monitored the income, property, and commercial activities of ordinary citizens, creating an environment in which financial transparency was not optional, but mandatory. From small villages to bustling cities, tax collectors and state officials were ever-present figures. Farmers, Merchants, artisans, and even landlords were required to report their earnings accurately, and discrepancies could lead to severe consequences. Local officials, often appointed by provincial governors, maintained detailed records of each household's assets and income. These records were cross-checked regularly, and failure to comply could result in fines, confiscation of property, or imprisonment. This meticulous monitoring ensured that the state maximised revenue while discouraging fraud, cheating, or tax evasion. Merchants, in particular, felt the weight of this constant oversight. Trade in markets and bazaars was subject to strict regulation, and officials frequently inspected goods, weighed commodities, and audited accounts to prevent corruption. Even travelling traders were required to declare their merchandise and pay appropriate taxes, as the empire relied heavily on trade duties to fund its administration. The presence of inspectors and auditors in marketplaces was a constant reminder that the state's eyes were everywhere, leaving little room for illegal activities or deception. The monitoring of personal income also extended to landowners and peasants. Land taxes, known as tithe or ushur, were levied based on the type and amount of crops produced. Officials visited farms to assess production, ensuring that the correct portion of goods was delivered to the state. This system required citizens to maintain accurate records and submit detailed reports, which were then verified by local authorities. Any attempt to underreport income or evade taxes could result in punishment ranging from fines to corporal penalties, reinforcing the importance of compliance in everyday life. This pervasive system of oversight created a constant sense of accountability among the populace. Citizens quickly realized that their wealth, no matter how modest, was under scrutiny. Families and communities often became involved in reporting tax compliance, further strengthening the state's reach. The consequences of failing to meet tax obligations were severe, and this pressure influenced nearly every aspect of life, from farming schedules and trade activities to household finances and personal behaviour. In addition to financial monitoring, officials also used these records to plan military conscription, allocate resources, and enforce other regulations. By understanding exactly how much each citizen or region produced, the empire could organise food distribution, levy soldiers for military campaigns, and maintain stability in its provinces. This systematic approach allowed the Ottomans to govern a vast and diverse territory efficiently, but it also meant that ordinary people lived under constant supervision, with their daily economic activities closely watched by the state. Ultimately, the monitoring of taxes and personal income was more than a bureaucratic task. It was a tool of control. Citizens knew that failing to comply could lead to financial ruin, punishment, or loss of social standing. This relentless oversight ensured that the empire remained powerful and well-funded, but it also created a life in which personal freedom was constrained and every action could be observed and judged by the authorities. For anyone unfamiliar with Ottoman governance, this pervasive supervision could be both intimidating and exhausting, demonstrating how the empire maintained control through a combination of administration, law, and constant vigilance. In the Ottoman Empire, daily life was shaped not only by strict laws and tax monitoring, but also by the constant presence of local leaders and officials who kept a watchful eye over neighbourhoods. The empire spanned vast and diverse territories, including cities, towns, and rural villages, each requiring its own system of oversight to maintain order. To achieve this, the Ottomans relied heavily on local leaders, known as muhtars, qadis, or appointed community elders, who acted as intermediaries between the central authorities and ordinary citizens. Their role was to enforce laws, report suspicious activity, and ensure that the residents complied with both legal and social expectations. These local leaders were deeply integrated into the fabric of community life. They knew the inhabitants personally, were aware of family histories, and often mediated minor disputes before they escalated. By leveraging their intimate knowledge of neighbourhoods, these leaders could detect potential criminal activity or signs of rebellion early on. In many ways, the local leader's presence was both protective and intimidating. They maintained a semblance of order while reminding citizens that the eyes of authority were never far away. Their influence extended to all aspects of daily life, from trade and agriculture to religious observances and social behaviour. In urban centres like Istanbul, Edirne and Bursa, local leaders were particularly vigilant due to the density and diversity of the population. They patrolled streets, supervised markets, and monitored taverns and public gathering places. Any unusual gatherings, suspicious behaviour or disputes could be reported immediately to higher authorities or directly to the governor. In rural areas, leaders ensured that peasants paid their taxes, worked their land according to obligations, and did not resist conscription or state orders. The constant presence of these figures created a community where residents quickly learned that misbehaviour or negligence could be observed and punished at any moment. Beyond enforcing laws and regulations, local leaders also played a critical role in implementing social norms. The Ottoman Empire was culturally and religiously diverse, and leaders ensured that communities followed accepted practices. For example, they monitored interactions between different social and religious groups, making sure that public behaviour conformed to both Sharia law and Qanun regulations. This oversight extended to festivals, market conduct, and even daily routines, ensuring that citizens acted within the bounds set by both religion and the state. Failure to comply could result in fines, imprisonment, or other punishments, reinforcing the authority of these local figures. The psychological impact of such constant supervision cannot be overstated. Citizens lived in a society where neighbours, community leaders, and officials could all serve as eyes for the state. People were cautious in their speech and actions, knowing that even minor infractions could be reported. This created a culture of vigilance and self-policing, where individuals monitored their own behaviour as much as the behaviour of others. The presence of local leaders ensured that law enforcement was continuous and pervasive, extending the reach of the central government into every corner of the empire. In addition to maintaining law and order, local leaders were responsible for mediating conflicts, maintaining communal infrastructure, and assisting with taxation and military recruitment. Their authority and oversight made neighbourhoods highly organised, but also created an environment where personal freedom was limited. Citizens quickly adapted to a system in which obedience and conformity were essential for survival. The omnipresent gaze of local leaders ensured that the central government's authority was felt daily, shaping behaviour, reinforcing social hierarchies, and maintaining the empire's stability across both urban and rural communities. In conclusion, local leaders acted as the backbone of Ottoman governance at the neighbourhood level. By keeping watch over daily life, enforcing laws, and ensuring compliance with social and religious norms, they maintained order and stability across the empire's vast territories. For ordinary citizens, this meant living under a constant reminder that authority was always near, and that deviation from expected behaviour could bring swift consequences. This intricate network of supervision contributed significantly to the empire's ability to manage its diverse population, illustrating how daily life in the Ottoman Empire was shaped by the ever-present eyes of those in power. In the Ottoman Empire, authority extended far beyond laws and taxation. It reached deeply into the daily routines of ordinary citizens. Life was organised and regulated in such a way that the state could monitor, guide, and influence almost every aspect of individual and communal activity. From the moment a person woke up until they went to bed, their daily life was subtly, but often explicitly, shaped by religious, legal, and social expectations enforced by the empire's officials. This pervasive control ensured that citizens remained productive, compliant, and loyal to the Sultan, while also maintaining social order across the vast territories of the empire. The empire relied on a network of local leaders, religious authorities, and government officials to enforce this structured routine. Religious observances were strictly monitored. Prayer times, mosque attendance, and fasting during Ramadan were expected, particularly for Muslim citizens. These routines were not merely spiritual obligations, they also functioned as tools of social cohesion and surveillance. For example, attending mosque at the designated times allowed local authorities to observe citizens in public spaces, ensuring compliance with both moral and legal norms. Similarly, merchants and artisans were expected to work according to specific schedules, aligning production and trade with market and taxation requirements. Beyond religious obligations, social and economic life was highly regulated. Markets opened and closed under the oversight of local officials, trade practices were standardised, and guilds often enforced rules for artisans to ensure quality and fairness. Farmers and labourers were required to follow strict work schedules, particularly during planting and harvest seasons, so that state-imposed taxes and food contributions could be collected efficiently. Missing deadlines or failing to follow prescribed routines could result in fines, confiscation of goods, or even corporal punishment. By regulating daily life in such detail, the empire ensured that citizens' labour, production, and behaviour aligned with state priorities. Even leisure and personal interactions were affected. Festivals, celebrations, and public gatherings were supervised to maintain order and prevent rebellion or disorder. Citizens were expected to conform to social hierarchies and cultural norms during these events, and deviation could attract attention from both local leaders and state authorities. Marriage, family obligations, and public conduct were also influenced by legal and religious rules. In this way, the Ottoman Empire did not just enforce laws in response to crimes, it proactively structured daily life to prevent disorder before it could occur. The psychological impact of such control was significant. People quickly internalized the rules of daily life, often policing themselves and others to avoid punishment or public shaming. Communities developed informal networks of observation, where neighbours monitored behaviour and reported irregularities. This created a culture of constant vigilance. Citizens were aware that even minor deviations from routine could be noticed and potentially punished. Compliance became a matter of survival, reinforcing the authority of local leaders and the central government. Moreover, the empire's focus on daily routines served practical administrative purposes. By regulating work schedules, religious observances, and social behaviours, officials could more effectively manage taxation, military recruitment, and public services. Coordinated routines allowed resources to be distributed efficiently, ensured timely payment of taxes, and maintained stability in densely populated urban centres as well as remote rural areas. The daily rhythms of life thus became a tool for governance, blending religious, social, and administrative control into a seamless system that governed every aspect of Ottoman society. In conclusion, the strict control over citizens' daily routines illustrates the pervasive reach of the Ottoman state into private and public life. By organising work, religious practice, social behaviour, and community interactions, the empire maintained stability and authority across vast and diverse territories. Ordinary citizens experienced constant oversight, internalising the expectations of the state to survive and thrive. For anyone unfamiliar with this system, it would quickly become clear that life in the Ottoman Empire was not just about obedience to laws. It was about living within a framework of daily routines meticulously designed to reinforce control, loyalty, and social order. One of the most distinctive and intimidating aspects of life in the Ottoman Empire was the empire's approach to military recruitment, particularly through the system known as the devshirme. For many families, the mere thought of their sons being selected for service was terrifying. The devshirme, often referred to as the blood tax, involved the periodic collection of young boys, primarily from Christian populations in the Balkans, who were then conscripted into military or administrative service for the empire. These boys, typically aged between 8 and 18, were forcibly taken from their families and trained to become part of the elite Janissary Corps or to serve in various civil administrative roles. While the system was intended to build loyalty and strengthen the empire for the individuals involved, it represented a profound loss of freedom and a dramatic shift in life's trajectory. The process of selection was systematic and rigorous. Ottoman officials would visit villages and towns, compiling records of families and assessing which children were suitable for conscription. Once selected, the boys were taken to centralised training centres, far from their homes and families. This separation was designed not only to remove them from local influences, but also to instill loyalty directly to the Sultan. For many families, the loss of a son was a source of grief and fear, as they had little to no say in the matter. The psychological impact on both children and parents was immense, reinforcing the authority of the empire and the inescapable nature of its power. Once conscripted, these young men underwent intensive training. The Janissaries, an elite military corps, received education in military tactics, weapons, discipline, and loyalty. They were expected to adhere to strict rules and follow the orders of their superiors without question. The training was designed to mould them into formidable soldiers, capable of serving in campaigns across the vast territories of the empire. Although some conscripts eventually rose to positions of influence and power, the initial experience was often harsh and dehumanizing, emphasizing obedience, skill, and the supremacy of the Sultan's authority. The devshirme system was not limited to the Balkans. It also applied in various provinces with non-Muslim populations, ensuring a steady stream of recruits loyal to the central government rather than local rulers or communities. This method of conscription allowed the Ottoman Empire to maintain a professional and disciplined army while preventing local uprisings or divided loyalties. However, for those young men forced into service, it was a sudden and dramatic disruption of their lives. Childhoods were abruptly replaced with strict routines, military drills, and an environment in which failure or disobedience could lead to severe punishment. The system also had profound social and psychological consequences. For the young recruits, life became one of intense discipline and structured learning. They were separated from their families, often converted to Islam if they were not already Muslim, and immersed in an environment designed to instill loyalty and obedience. For ordinary citizens, the possibility of losing a child to conscription served as a stark reminder of the state's authority. It reinforced the understanding that the empire could intervene in the most personal aspects of life, controlling not only property, income, and behaviour, but even the destiny of individual children. Despite its harshness, the Devshirme system created an elite military force that became central to the Ottoman Empire's power. The Janissaries were known for their discipline, loyalty, and effectiveness in battle, often serving as a stabilising force within the empire. Yet for those young men drafted into service, survival required adaptation, resilience, and acceptance of a life dictated by the state. The experience illustrates the lengths to which the Ottoman Empire went to maintain military strength and centralised control, ensuring that citizens understood the consequences of resistance, non-compliance, or failure to meet the empire's demands. Once young men were conscripted into the Ottoman military through the Devshirme system, their lives changed dramatically. The moment they arrived at training centres, they were immersed in a highly structured environment designed to transform them into elite soldiers loyal to the Sultan. Discipline was the cornerstone of their education. Every aspect of daily life, sleeping arrangements, meals, study, physical training, and drills, was regulated to instill obedience and resilience. The training was demanding, both physically and mentally, and any deviation from the rules was met with immediate correction or punishment. The Janissaries, the empire's elite corps, were the primary recipients of this rigorous training. They learned the use of weapons, including swords, bows, and firearms, and practiced battlefield formations and tactics. Beyond combat skills, recruits were educated in reading, writing, and sometimes languages, which allowed them to serve in administrative or intelligence roles later. Yet the focus was always on loyalty and discipline. The system sought to mould these young men into tools of the state rather than independent individuals. Authority figures were strict and unforgiving, emphasising that failure, hesitation, or insubordination could threaten not only the individual's life, but also the cohesion of the entire military unit. Training was also designed to separate recruits from their previous lives. By isolating them from family and community influences, the empire ensured that their identity became tied solely to their role as soldiers or civil servants. This psychological conditioning reinforced loyalty to the Sultan above all else. The recruits learned to obey orders without question, carry out duties with precision, and endure hardships without complaint. This rigorous routine fostered resilience, endurance, and adaptability, qualities essential for soldiers who would serve in campaigns across far-flung provinces and battlefields. Discipline extended to personal conduct as well. Janissaries were expected to maintain a high standard of behaviour, both in training and in public life. Misconduct, laziness, or disrespect was punished immediately, often through physical reprimands or additional drills. Over time, the strict environment created a highly organised and efficient force capable of executing complex military strategies. Every recruit understood that their survival and success depended on adherence to the rules, punctuality, and absolute obedience. The training system also had long-term implications for the structure of the Ottoman military. By enforcing uniformity, discipline, and loyalty from a young age, the empire created a professional army that was not reliant on feudal levies or local militias. The Janissaries became a central pillar of Ottoman power, capable of defending the empire, maintaining internal order, and supporting the Sultan in times of crisis. However, this level of control came at a personal cost for the recruits, who were often separated from their families for years, experienced strict regimentation, and faced the constant threat of punishment for even minor infractions. Living under such rigorous training was a test of endurance, adaptability, and obedience. Young men had to navigate intense physical challenges, strict schedules, and authoritarian oversight, all while learning to function as part of a highly disciplined unit. The experience shaped their identity, loyalty, and worldview, reinforcing the dominance of the Ottoman state in every aspect of life. For outsiders or newcomers, witnessing this level of discipline could be both awe-inspiring and intimidating, highlighting the empire's ability to exert control over individuals from the very start of their adult lives. In the Ottoman Empire, the authority of the state extended far beyond ordinary legal and social control. It could reach into the lives of citizens at any moment, especially regarding military service. Once a young man was registered for potential conscription, he could be summoned by officials at any time, often without prior notice. This unpredictability was a deliberate strategy by the empire to maintain control and readiness. Families never knew when their sons might be taken, and the boys themselves had to be prepared to leave home instantly. This system instilled a deep sense of obedience and awareness that the Sultan's authority could intervene in even the most personal aspects of life. The power of officials to summon recruits at any time was not limited to new conscripts. Even those already serving in the Janissary Corps or other military units could be recalled to the central authority for special assignments, training, or deployment. This ensured that the state had access to a flexible, responsive military force capable of acting wherever and whenever the empire required. The unpredictability of summons reinforced the understanding that loyalty and readiness were not optional, and that personal plans or desires were secondary to the needs of the empire. For families, this created anxiety and constant vigilance as they lived under the shadow of possible removal of their sons. The process of summoning was both formal and authoritative. Officials would arrive at a family's home, sometimes accompanied by local leaders or other state representatives, to deliver the order. Refusal or delay in compliance was considered an act of disobedience and could carry serious consequences. In extreme cases, resistance might lead to fines, imprisonment, or the use of force. The empire's ability to enforce these summons effectively ensured that no family could completely evade the state's demands, reinforcing the power of central authority over local communities and private households alike. This system also had significant social and psychological effects. Young men grew up knowing that they could be removed from their families, villages, or workplaces at any moment. The possibility of an unexpected summons fostered discipline, adaptability, and resilience, but it also created a constant undercurrent of anxiety. Families adapted to this reality by preparing children mentally and physically for potential conscription, while communities reinforced loyalty to the state to avoid drawing attention. The omnipresence of official authority became a defining feature of life in the empire, shaping personal behaviour and community dynamics alike. The ability to summon recruits at any time also ensured that the Ottoman military remained highly effective and responsive. In times of war or unrest, the empire could rapidly mobilise forces, drawing from trained or partially trained individuals scattered across its territories. This flexibility gave the Ottoman army a strategic advantage over enemies who relied on slower recruitment methods or feudal levies. At the same time, it reinforced the sense of omnipotence the state held over ordinary citizens, who were reminded daily that their lives and labour ultimately served the needs of the empire. For the young recruits themselves, this meant living in a state of constant readiness. Even routine activities could be disrupted by an official summons, forcing them to quickly leave behind family, work, or social life. The unpredictability was part of the empire's strategy to break attachments to local communities and strengthen loyalty directly to the Sultan. Over time, recruits learned to adapt to sudden changes, endure hardships, and accept that their personal freedoms were secondary to the demands of the state. The system of immediate summons highlights the level of control the Ottoman Empire exercised over its citizens. It was not merely about conscription or military strength. It was a tool to enforce obedience, loyalty, and readiness throughout society. The knowledge that officials could appear at any time to summon a young man for service reinforced the omnipresence of state authority and the inescapable responsibilities of citizenship within the empire. For families and recruits alike, it was a constant reminder that survival and success depended on unwavering compliance with the demands of the Ottoman state. Life in the Ottoman Empire was not only shaped by strict laws and military conscription, but also by the constant threat of danger on its streets. Across cities, towns, and rural areas, citizens often faced the risk of robbery, ambush, and attacks from bandits or highwaymen. Roads connecting villages, trading centres, and urban hubs were essential for commerce, communication, and military movement, but they were also prime targets for criminal activity. Merchants transporting goods, travellers moving between towns, and even local villagers could find themselves vulnerable to sudden and violent assaults. The empire's vastness made it challenging for authorities to patrol every route continuously, leaving many areas exposed to lawlessness. Banditry was especially common in rural regions and along trade routes. Groups of armed robbers would lie in wait along forested paths, river crossings, or mountain passes, striking travellers and caravans without warning. These attacks were often organised and strategic, targeting wealthy merchants or loaded caravans carrying valuable goods such as spices, textiles, or precious metals. For ordinary citizens, even a short journey could involve significant risk, as travel required vigilance, careful planning, and sometimes armed protection. Fear of robbery was a daily reality, shaping how people conducted business, travelled, and interacted with others in their communities. Urban areas were not entirely safe either. Narrow streets, crowded markets, and alleys provided opportunities for thieves to strike unsuspecting citizens. Pickpocketing, muggings, and sudden assaults were common, particularly in busy marketplaces or during festivals when crowds made it easier for criminals to operate unnoticed. Local authorities and neighbourhood watch systems attempted to mitigate these threats, but the sheer scale of cities and the constant movement of people made complete security impossible. Citizens learned to take precautions, travelling in groups, carrying weapons for self-defence, and avoiding isolated areas whenever possible. The threat of robbery had broader social and economic consequences. Merchants often had to hire guards or pay tolls to ensure the safe transport of goods, increasing the cost of trade and limiting profitability. Farmers transporting harvest to market faced similar risks, potentially losing vital income if they fell victim to bandits. These dangers created a culture of caution and vigilance, influencing daily routines, travel decisions, and community interactions. People were constantly aware that danger could strike at any moment, reinforcing the idea that life in the empire required preparedness and caution. In response to the prevalence of street crimes, the Ottoman authorities implemented various measures to protect citizens and maintain order. Patrols were conducted in urban centres, and guards were stationed along major trade routes and mountain passes. In some regions, local leaders and communities organised watch groups to deter bandits and alert authorities when attacks occurred. Punishments for caught criminals were severe, often involving public execution or corporal punishment, which served both to penalise offenders and deter others. Despite these efforts, the vastness of the empire and the mobility of bandits meant that streets remained perilous, and citizens could never fully escape the risk of attack. The psychological impact of these dangers was significant. Living with the constant threat of robbery-shaped behaviour, encouraging vigilance, mistrust of strangers, and careful planning in everyday life. Families taught their children to be cautious, travellers learned to travel in groups, and merchants adapted by taking longer but safer routes. This ever-present risk was a part of life in the Ottoman Empire, reinforcing the notion that survival depended not only on obedience to laws and loyalty to the state, but also on practical awareness of immediate dangers. Ultimately, frequent robberies and attacks on streets highlight the challenges of living in a vast, diverse empire where law enforcement could not be omnipresent. Citizens had to navigate a world in which danger was part of daily life, balancing their obligations to the state with the need for personal safety. The presence of bandits and robbers served as a stark reminder of the uncertainties that came with travel, trade, and even routine movement, shaping the experiences and behaviours of ordinary people across the empire. In the Ottoman Empire, travelling along roads and trade routes was never without risk. Merchants, pilgrims, and ordinary travellers faced the constant threat of looting by bandits and armed gangs. Caravans, which were the backbone of long-distance trade, often carried valuable goods such as spices, textiles, coins, and precious metals. These convoys were prime targets because of the wealth they transported, and the difficulty of protecting them across vast stretches of countryside. Bandits took advantage of remote areas, mountain passes, and unmonitored roads to stage sudden attacks, striking quickly and often disappearing before authorities could respond. The organisation of these robberies was often calculated. Bandits would gather intelligence about the movement of caravans, noting routes, schedules, and the number of guards. Attacks were typically executed at night or in isolated areas, maximising surprise and minimising resistance. Travellers were vulnerable because roads could stretch for days without settlements or protection. Those travelling alone or in small groups faced the highest risks, while larger caravans sometimes hired armed escorts to deter attackers. Even then, the threat of looting was never completely eliminated, and losses could be devastating, both financially and physically. The consequences of caravan attacks went beyond immediate loss. Merchants risked financial ruin if their goods were stolen, which could affect trade, networks, and local economies. Travellers who were robbed often faced injury or even death, and families dependent on remittances or trade income suffered greatly. The fear of such attacks influenced behaviour. Merchants altered routes to avoid dangerous regions, travelled only during daylight, or invested in guards and protective measures. Communities along these routes also became cautious, as the presence of bandits could threaten local safety and disrupt daily life. Ottoman authorities were aware of these risks and implemented measures to protect trade and maintain public order. Military escorts were sometimes dispatched for particularly valuable or large caravans, while patrols monitored known bandit hotspots. Local officials and community leaders were tasked with reporting suspicious activity and apprehending criminals. Punishments for captured bandits were harsh and public, often serving as a deterrent for others who might consider attacking travellers. Nevertheless, the sheer size of the empire and the remoteness of many regions meant that looting remained a persistent threat. The psychological impact of potential attacks influenced travel and trade decisions. Merchants carefully planned journeys, choosing safer, but often longer, routes to avoid ambushes. Travellers remained alert, carrying weapons or travelling in groups for protection. This constant need for vigilance created a culture where preparation, caution, and awareness were essential for survival. Even experienced travellers could not take safety for granted, and stories of looted caravans spread quickly, reinforcing fear and respect for the dangers of the road. Looting also had social and political implications. Banditry was often a response to economic hardship, political instability, or weak local governance. In some cases, bandits enjoyed the tacit support of local communities, making enforcement even more challenging. This blurred the line between criminal activity and social resistance, complicating the empire's efforts to maintain control over its territories. The threat of looting, therefore, was not only a practical concern for merchants and travellers, but also a reminder of the empire's need to assert authority across diverse and far-flung regions. Ultimately, the looting of caravans and travellers highlights the precarious nature of movement and commerce in the Ottoman Empire. Wealth and resources were constantly at risk, and survival required careful planning, vigilance, and sometimes armed protection. For ordinary citizens and merchants alike, the roads were as much a place of opportunity as they were of danger, and the possibility of encountering bandits remained a defining feature of life in the empire. In the Ottoman Empire, the dangers of daily life extended beyond laws, taxes, and banditry. Travel itself could be treacherous, especially after sunset. Nighttime travel was considered particularly perilous due to the combination of darkness, isolation, and the threat of ambush. Roads connecting villages, towns, and cities were often unlit and poorly maintained, winding through forests, mountains, and deserts, where criminals could strike without warning. Citizens travelling after dark faced heightened vulnerability to thieves, highwaymen, and even wild animals, making night journeys a high-risk endeavour that required careful planning and caution. Merchants transporting goods were among the most affected by these risks. While daylight offered visibility and the possibility of encountering other travellers for protection, night travel left caravans exposed. Bandits preferred attacking under the cover of darkness, using the shadows to conceal their movements and create confusion. Even a well-armed group of travellers could be caught off guard by an ambush, especially if they were unfamiliar with the terrain. For traders whose livelihoods depended on safely delivering goods, the risk of travelling at night could result in financial disaster or personal injury, forcing many to wait until daylight to continue their journeys. Ordinary citizens were also vulnerable. Pilgrims, labourers, messengers, and anyone moving between settlements faced similar threats. Roads outside urban centres were sparsely populated, and the absence of guards or patrols meant that travellers often had no immediate assistance if attacked. Families sending sons, husbands, or relatives on trips had to weigh the urgency of travel against the risk of nighttime danger. Many travellers adopted precautions such as travelling in groups, carrying weapons, or arranging temporary stops in safer settlements to minimise exposure. Despite these measures, the threat of attack remained ever present, shaping daily schedules and social behaviour across the empire. Nighttime hazards were compounded by the lack of lighting and navigation aids. Unlike modern roads with lamps and markers, Ottoman streets and country paths were largely dark at night, making it difficult to see potential dangers or identify approaching threats. Travellers relied on torches, lanterns or moonlight, but these offered limited protection. The difficulty of detecting danger early meant that a night traveller had little opportunity to evade bandits or prepare for an attack, heightening the risk of injury, theft or worse. The state attempted to mitigate some of these risks through patrols, especially in urban centres and along major trade routes. Officials, guards and local leaders were responsible for monitoring suspicious activity and providing security where possible. However, the vast size of the empire, combined with the limited reach of law enforcement in remote regions, meant that complete protection was impossible. Citizens quickly learned that their safety at night depended largely on their own vigilance, preparation, and adherence to local advice about safer routes and travel schedules. This ever-present danger influenced social behaviour and daily life. Nighttime activities were limited, with markets, public gatherings, and travel often restricted to daylight hours whenever possible. People adapted to the reality that darkness brought risk, and communities developed informal support systems to ensure safety. Neighbours travelling together, local guides familiar with the terrain, and coordinated schedules to avoid isolated areas. Despite these precautions, the knowledge that danger lurked in the shadows created anxiety and shaped the way citizens moved through the world. The risks of travelling at night also reflected the broader challenges of governance and security in the Ottoman Empire. The state could enforce laws, collect taxes and conscript soldiers, but controlling every mile of road after dark was impossible. Banditry and crime exploited this gap, making nighttime travel a test of planning, courage and survival skills. Citizens quickly internalised the lesson. Night travel was a gamble, and survival often depended on awareness, preparedness and cautious decision-making. In the Ottoman Empire, social hierarchy played a significant role in determining who had access to essential resources, especially during periods of food scarcity or famine. The distinction between nobility and commoners was stark, and survival often depended on one's social standing. Nobles, high-ranking officials and wealthy landowners enjoyed privileges that shielded them from the most severe consequences of shortages, while ordinary citizens were left to endure hunger, rationing and uncertainty. This division was not only economic but also reinforced by legal, administrative and cultural practices that constantly reminded people of their place within the empire. Nobles and high-ranking officials had direct access to stored food supplies, wealth and state resources. They could secure grain, livestock and other essentials even during years of poor harvests. Their status allowed them to purchase provisions at higher prices or receive preferential treatment from local authorities. Estates and mansions often maintained private storage for months or even years, ensuring that noble families remained fed while surrounding communities struggled. The Ottoman elite also had the political leverage to request additional support from the state, further insulating them from the effects of famine. For commoners, the reality was much harsher. Farmers, labourers, and urban dwellers depended on local markets and communal storage, which were vulnerable to shortages, theft, and price inflation. During famines or periods of scarcity, food prices could skyrocket, making even basic staples like bread, grains, and meat difficult to afford. Families often had to reduce meals, substitute inferior foods, or work longer hours just to secure enough nourishment. The stark contrast between the sustenance of the nobility and the struggles of ordinary people highlighted the rigid social hierarchy, reinforcing both obedience and social order in difficult times. The legal and administrative structure of the empire also reinforced this distinction. Nobles were often exempt from certain taxes or were granted relief during food shortages, while commoners remained liable for their full share of levies. State resources, such as granaries and emergency food reserves, were sometimes allocated first to officials, soldiers, and the elite before reaching ordinary citizens. This system underscored the unequal access to resources and reinforced a social dynamic in which commoners understood their dependence on those above them for survival. The cultural implications were equally significant. Public displays of wealth, abundance, and privilege by the nobility served as constant reminders of social disparity. Weddings, banquets, and ceremonies showcased the elite's access to plentiful food, while ordinary citizens witnessed scarcity firsthand. This visibility of inequality not only reinforced hierarchy, but also created an environment where obedience and deference to authority were perceived as necessary for survival. People learned that maintaining favour with local leaders or nobles could mean access to food, protection, or other resources during times of crisis. Moreover, famine and scarcity often forced difficult choices upon ordinary families. Parents had to ration food for children, households had to prioritise labour over rest to earn money for sustenance, and communities sometimes competed for limited resources. Meanwhile, the nobility could continue their lives with relative comfort, illustrating how social status directly influenced survival. The gulf between classes made life during scarcity a daily reminder that one's position in the social hierarchy determined not only privilege, but also vulnerability. The distinction between nobility and commoners during times of food scarcity highlights the broader dynamics of power in the Ottoman Empire. Access to resources was not purely a matter of luck or ability, but was deeply intertwined with social, economic, and political structures. Ordinary citizens experienced hunger and hardship firsthand, while the elite maintained comfort and security. This disparity reinforced obedience, loyalty, and acceptance of the social order, ensuring that even in times of crisis, the hierarchical structure of the empire remained intact. In the Ottoman Empire, the lives of workers and peasants were tightly constrained, particularly during times of food scarcity and economic hardship. Unlike the nobility, who enjoyed wealth, resources, and protections, ordinary citizens faced strict limitations on their personal freedoms, work, and mobility. Their labour, land, and produce were often subject to oversight by local authorities or landowners, leaving little room for autonomy. Survival for peasants and labourers depended on compliance with the demands of both the state and local elites, creating a life defined by restriction, hard work, and limited agency. Peasants, who formed the majority of the population, were bound to the land they worked and the taxes they owed to landlords or the state. During periods of famine or scarcity, these obligations did not diminish. Farmers were required to deliver fixed portions of their harvests, even if it meant facing personal hunger or hardship. Landlords often enforced these quotas strictly, and failure to meet them could result in fines, corporal punishment, or confiscation of property. The need to satisfy external demands left peasants with little control over their labour, harvests, or the timing of their work, emphasising the imbalance of power between the elite and commoners. Urban workers faced similar restrictions. Artisans, merchants, and labourers were subject to guild regulations, market rules, and taxation requirements that limited their freedom to operate independently. Guilds controlled trade practices, pricing, and access to certain professions, meaning that workers could not freely choose their work or negotiate wages beyond prescribed limits. In addition, urban workers were often responsible for delivering food and goods to state authorities or local markets under strict schedules, leaving little flexibility in their daily routines. Even in cities, the combination of scarcity and regulation reinforced the restricted nature of workers' lives. Mobility was another area where freedoms were limited. Peasants could not easily leave their villages or lands without permission, as movement could disrupt taxation records, labour availability, or agricultural output. Travelling for work, trade, or safety during famine required official authorisation, which could be difficult to obtain. Urban labourers were similarly constrained, often tied to specific districts, workshops, or employers. These limitations ensured that the state maintained control over the population and could extract labour, produce, and taxes efficiently, but they also restricted personal autonomy and opportunities for upward mobility. Scarcity intensified these limitations. During times of famine, peasants and workers had to devote more time and energy to secure sufficient food for themselves and their families, while still meeting obligations to landlords or officials. Ordinary citizens could not easily negotiate for relief, reduce workloads, or escape to alternative regions. Survival depended on compliance with the rules imposed from above. Limited access to resources, combined with strict oversight, reinforced the hierarchical structure of society and highlighted the dependency of commoners on those in positions of power. Social and psychological effects were significant. The knowledge that freedoms were restricted fostered acceptance of authority as a necessary condition for survival. Peasants and workers learned to follow rules carefully, avoid conflicts with landlords or officials, and rely on community networks for mutual support. These constraints shaped behaviour, relationships, and expectations, ensuring that ordinary citizens internalized the limitations imposed upon them and adapted to a life of regulated labour and restricted personal choice. Even in moments of personal initiative or skill, workers and peasants had to navigate restrictions carefully. Innovation in farming, craft production, or trade was often constrained by state policies or guild regulations, and any deviation could attract scrutiny or punishment. The daily reality for the majority of the population was a careful balancing act, fulfilling obligations, securing sustenance, and surviving within a system that left them little personal freedom. The limited freedoms for workers and peasants illustrate how social hierarchy, scarcity, and state control intersected in the Ottoman Empire. Ordinary citizens were expected to labour, comply, and endure hardships while having minimal autonomy or leverage. Their restricted freedoms ensured that resources flowed to the state and the elite, reinforcing authority and maintaining social order. Life under these conditions demanded resilience, adaptation, and constant vigilance, reflecting the pervasive control that characterized daily life in the empire. In the Ottoman Empire, social hierarchy was not only evident in privileges and access to resources, but also in the way rights and punishments were applied during times of scarcity and crisis. Nobles, landowners, and officials enjoyed protections and privileges that shielded them from the harshest consequences of famine, legal infractions, or economic failure. Ordinary citizens such as peasants, labourers, and urban workers experienced far stricter enforcement of rules and faced severe penalties for actions that might be overlooked among the elite. This disparity created a society in which one's social status directly influenced survival, justice, and personal security. For the nobility, wealth and influence provided access to legal protection and leniency. If a noble family failed to meet tax obligations or violated minor regulations, they could often negotiate reductions, defer payments, or appeal to higher authorities. They also had the resources to secure private food stores during times of scarcity, ensuring that shortages had minimal impact on their well-being. Punishments for crimes committed by the elite were often symbolic or ceremonial, serving more to maintain the appearance of justice than to inflict real hardship. These protections reinforced the social divide, emphasizing that laws and penalties were applied unevenly based on status. Commoners, on the other hand, lived under strict enforcement of rules, with little room for negotiation or leniency. Peasants were required to deliver a fixed portion of their harvests regardless of crop yield, and failure to comply could result in fines, physical punishment, or confiscation of property. Urban workers and labourers faced similar constraints, as guild rules, market regulations, and tax obligations were applied rigorously. The consequences of non-compliance were immediate and often severe, leaving ordinary citizens highly vulnerable during periods of famine, economic hardship, or personal misfortune. This disparity extended to legal rights as well. In disputes over land, property, or commercial transactions, commoners had limited ability to challenge nobles or officials. Courts and local authorities often favoured those with wealth, influence, or connections, making it difficult for ordinary people to assert their rights. During famines, the unequal application of law could become life-threatening. Nobles could hoard or ration food with impunity, while peasants could face punishment for taking similar measures to feed their families. The uneven system of justice reinforced the social hierarchy, reminding citizens that survival depended not only on compliance, but also on one's social position. The psychological and social effects of this inequality were profound. Ordinary citizens learned to navigate a world where obedience, deference, and adherence to rules were essential for survival. Communities developed informal strategies to protect themselves, such as collective work, mutual aid, or negotiating with local authorities. The visible difference in how rights and punishments were applied reinforced the awareness of social status from a young age, shaping behaviour, expectations, and social interactions throughout life. The unequal application of laws and punishments also strengthened the power of local leaders in the state. By ensuring that the elite maintained privileges while ordinary citizens bore the brunt of enforcement, the Ottoman administration could maintain social order and stability. Citizens were constantly reminded of their place within the hierarchy, and this awareness encouraged compliance with state policies, tax collection, and labour obligations. Even minor infractions could carry significant consequences for commoners, while nobles often operated above such constraints. Ultimately, the variation in rights and punishments based on social status illustrates how the Ottoman Empire maintained control over a vast and diverse population. Wealth, influence, and position determined not only access to resources, but also protection under the law, reinforcing both the privileges of the elite and the vulnerability of ordinary citizens. For the majority of the population, life involved constant adaptation to these disparities, emphasizing obedience, caution, and resilience as essential tools for survival in a hierarchical and often unforgiving society. In the Ottoman Empire, the everyday life of ordinary citizens was often overshadowed by the constant threat of hunger and malnutrition. Despite the empire's vast territories and abundant resources in some regions, food distribution was highly uneven, and agricultural productivity could be disrupted by poor harvests, natural disasters, or local mismanagement. For the majority of peasants, labourers, and urban poor, insufficient food intake was a common reality. Hunger was not only a physical hardship but also a pervasive social and economic issue, influencing every aspect of daily life from work performance to family stability. Malnutrition affected all age groups, but was particularly severe for children and the elderly. Young children required proper nutrition for growth and development, yet families struggling to secure basic staples often had to ration meals, providing limited quantities of grains or legumes instead of a balanced diet. Malnourished children were more susceptible to disease, stunted growth, and cognitive delays, while adults who lacked sufficient calories and nutrients experienced fatigue, weakened immunity, and reduced labour productivity. The cycle of hunger and poor health reinforced poverty, as those who could not work effectively often fell deeper into deprivation. In urban areas, workers and artisans faced similar challenges. Food prices fluctuated based on supply, transport costs, and local taxation, often making basic staples unaffordable for low-income households. Bread, the primary staple, could be rationed or sold at inflated prices, and access to meat, dairy, and fresh produce was limited for ordinary citizens. Families had to make difficult choices, prioritizing calories over nutritional value and survival over taste or variety. This constant struggle for sustenance created daily stress and uncertainty, shaping the routines, decisions, and priorities of communities across the empire. Peasants in rural areas, despite working the land, were not immune to hunger. Agricultural production depended on weather conditions, seasonal cycles, and the state's demands for taxes and tribute. Even when crops were plentiful, a significant portion of the harvest was claimed by landlords or the state, leaving families with barely enough to survive. Natural disasters, droughts, or pest infestations could exacerbate shortages, creating periods of famine that pushed malnutrition to extreme levels. In such conditions, survival often required improvisation, such as consuming less desirable foods, foraging, or travelling in search of assistance. Hunger and malnutrition also had broader social consequences. Communities weakened by chronic food insecurity were less able to work collectively, defend themselves, or participate fully in social and economic life. Illness and disease spread more easily among malnourished populations, and mortality rates increased during periods of extreme scarcity. The physical effects of hunger, fatigue, frailty, and weakened health impacted labour output, trade, and the stability of local economies, creating a cycle in which scarcity reinforced hardship. The empire's authorities were aware of these challenges, and sometimes attempted to mitigate them through grain storage, regulated markets, or emergency relief programs. Granaries in major cities stored reserves that could be used during shortages, and officials occasionally intervened to prevent extreme price inflation or provide aid to the most vulnerable. However, these measures were often insufficient or unevenly distributed, and access frequently depended on social status, wealth, and proximity to urban centres. Ordinary citizens continued to bear the brunt of food insecurity, while elites and state officials were largely insulated from its most severe effects. Daily life under the threat of hunger required adaptation, resilience, and resourcefulness. Families carefully managed food, planned meals, and prioritized essential consumption over comfort. Communities developed informal support systems, such as sharing resources, cooperative farming, and mutual aid to survive periods of scarcity. Despite these efforts, malnutrition remained a constant challenge, shaping behavior, social structures, and expectations in Ottoman society. Hunger and malnutrition were not simply physical hardships, they were central to the lived experience of ordinary citizens. The scarcity of food influenced every aspect of life, from work productivity to family dynamics, and served as a constant reminder of vulnerability under the empire's social and economic structures. Survival required constant vigilance, adaptation, and acceptance of a reality in which food security was never guaranteed. In the Ottoman Empire, the impact of natural disasters such as droughts extended far beyond poor harvests, creating severe economic strain for ordinary citizens. When crops failed due to prolonged dry spells, food scarcity became a pressing issue, leading to rising prices, inflation, and heightened competition for essential resources. Grain, the primary staple of the population, was particularly affected, and any reduction in supply immediately caused prices to spike. For peasants, labourers, and urban workers, this combination of scarcity and inflation made survival an ongoing challenge, highlighting the precariousness of life in the empire. Droughts disrupted agricultural cycles, reducing yields of wheat, barley, and other essential crops. Farmers struggled to produce enough to satisfy both state taxes and their own families' needs. The government collected levies regardless of the severity of the harvest, leaving peasants with insufficient food for sustenance. When crops failed, grain and other foodstuffs became scarce in local markets, which forced merchants to raise prices dramatically. Ordinary citizens often faced the impossible choice of paying inflated prices or going hungry. This created widespread hardship, particularly among those already living on the margins of subsistence. Urban populations were especially vulnerable to the ripple effects of drought-induced inflation. Cities depended on a steady flow of agricultural products from rural areas to feed their inhabitants. When harvests fell short, supply chains broke down, and food prices surged. Labourers, artisans, and low-income households saw their purchasing power diminish, making it increasingly difficult to afford even basic necessities. Families were forced to cut meal portions, substitute cheaper foods, or skip meals entirely, while wealthier citizens were largely insulated from these shortages. The growing disparity between classes became painfully evident during these periods, reinforcing social hierarchies and inequality. Inflation during droughts was compounded by opportunistic practices. Some merchants and landowners hoarded grain or manipulated prices to maximize profit, further restricting access for the most vulnerable. Storage facilities could hold back essential commodities until prices rose, creating artificial scarcity that worsened famine conditions. For ordinary citizens, these practices created distrust and anxiety, as it became increasingly difficult to predict when and where food could be obtained. Communities learned to navigate these challenges by travelling to more reliable markets, pooling resources, or relying on informal trade networks. The state attempted to intervene, but its reach was limited. Officials maintained granaries in major cities, but distribution was often uneven, favouring elites, soldiers, and government officials. Local authorities sometimes attempted price controls or emergency relief, but enforcement was inconsistent across the empire's vast and diverse territories. The combination of limited government intervention, natural scarcity, and inflation ensured that ordinary citizens bore the brunt of drought's consequences. Survival required careful planning, resilience, and constant adaptation to changing conditions. Drought-induced inflation also had social and psychological consequences. The scarcity of food and rising prices created stress, uncertainty, and tension within communities. Families worried not only about daily sustenance, but also about long-term survival, planning strategies to conserve resources and protect vulnerable members. Social cohesion could be strained as competition for food increased, and communal solidarity became both a necessity and a challenge. Citizens learned to rely on local networks of mutual aid, sharing information, resources, and protection in the face of scarcity. Even after a drought ended, its effects persisted. Elevated food prices, depleted resources, and weakened populations could linger for months, leaving ordinary citizens in a prolonged state of vulnerability. The combination of natural disaster, economic instability, and social inequality reinforced the reality that survival in the Ottoman Empire required both awareness of environmental conditions and the ability to adapt quickly to sudden changes. Inflation and scarcity during droughts illustrate the fragile balance between natural resources, social structures, and economic stability in the Ottoman Empire. Ordinary citizens had to navigate unpredictable shortages, soaring prices, and limited access to government aid, while wealthier classes remained largely insulated from these hardships. Life during these periods demanded resourcefulness, resilience, and constant vigilance to endure the challenges of hunger, scarcity, and economic uncertainty. In the Ottoman Empire, access to food was heavily influenced by social status, wealth, and location. While nobles, high-ranking officials, and landowners could maintain reserves and store food safely for months, ordinary citizens faced severe limitations in both supply and storage. This disparity left peasants, labourers, and urban dwellers vulnerable to hunger, spoilage, and market fluctuations. The scarcity of storage options compounded the challenges of everyday survival, as even when food was available, ordinary families could not secure it for future use, forcing them to consume it immediately or risk losing it to spoilage or theft. Grain and other staples were often the backbone of a family's diet, but storing these essentials required proper facilities, knowledge, and resources that most ordinary citizens lacked. Wealthy households maintained private granaries, cool cellars, and storage systems that protected their food from spoilage, rodents, and thieves. These reserves could sustain families during times of scarcity, drought, or famine, allowing the elite to remain relatively unaffected by fluctuations in supply. In contrast, peasants and labourers often relied on small baskets, sacks, or basic storage spaces, which were inadequate for long-term preservation. This meant that even modest surpluses had to be consumed quickly or risk being lost, limiting the ability to prepare for future shortages. Access to food itself was also limited by social and economic barriers. Ordinary citizens depended on local markets for daily necessities, but food prices could fluctuate dramatically due to harvest failures, droughts, or transportation disruptions. During times of scarcity, wealthier buyers often secured the bulk of available supplies, leaving less for commoners. Additionally, local authorities sometimes prioritized distribution to the elite, government officials, or soldiers, further restricting ordinary citizens' access. This created a cycle in which the poor had to expend more time, energy, and money just to obtain enough food for basic survival. Rural communities faced their own challenges. Even when villagers produced crops, much of the harvest was claimed by landlords or used to pay taxes, leaving families with limited quantities for personal consumption. Storage was minimal, and exposure to the elements, pests, or theft could quickly reduce what little they had. In urban areas, small households lacked proper storage facilities, and perishable goods could spoil within days. The combination of limited storage capacity and variable supply meant that ordinary people had to carefully manage meals and ration food meticulously, often relying on daily purchases rather than stockpiling for the future. The consequences of limited access to food and storage were significant. Families often consumed unbalanced diets, relying heavily on bread or grains while lacking protein, fresh vegetables, or other nutrients. This contributed to malnutrition, weakened immune systems, and increased vulnerability to disease. Children, the elderly, and pregnant women were particularly affected, suffering long-term health consequences from insufficient nutrition. The inability to store food also amplified the social and economic gap between classes, as wealthier households could ride out shortages while ordinary citizens faced immediate hunger and deprivation. Communities adapted to these challenges through collective strategies. Villagers and neighbours sometimes shared storage space, pooled resources, or coordinated purchases to reduce spoilage and improve access. Markets and guilds occasionally provided guidance on preservation techniques, but these measures were limited and often insufficient to prevent scarcity. The daily struggle to manage food supply required constant attention, careful planning, and resilience, reinforcing the precariousness of ordinary life in the empire. Limited access to food and storage for ordinary people illustrates the intersection of social hierarchy, resource control, and survival in the Ottoman Empire. While the elite maintained stability and security, ordinary citizens lived with uncertainty, scarcity, and vulnerability. Daily life demanded constant vigilance, adaptation, and careful management of resources, underscoring the challenges faced by the majority of the population and the stark inequalities that shaped their existence. In the Ottoman Empire, the threat of infectious disease was a constant and deadly reality. Epidemics such as plague, measles, smallpox, and typhus swept through cities, towns, and rural areas with devastating consequences. These outbreaks were intensified by overcrowding, poor sanitation, limited medical knowledge, and the close living quarters of ordinary citizens. While the empire was vast and diverse, the vulnerability of the population to contagious diseases was universal, cutting across regions, classes, and communities, though the poor were disproportionately affected. The plague in particular was one of the most feared diseases in the empire. Often carried by fleas on rats, it could decimate entire neighbourhoods in a matter of weeks. Symptoms were sudden and severe, with fever, swelling of lymph nodes, and rapid deterioration leading to death in many cases. Citizens had little effective means to prevent infection, and hospitals were often overcrowded or poorly equipped to handle the surge of patients. Families frequently faced impossible choices: care for sick relatives at home, risking their own health, or leave them isolated in hopes of limiting the spread. The social and psychological impact of the plague was profound, instilling fear, mistrust, and a pervasive sense of vulnerability. Measles and smallpox were similarly widespread, particularly affecting children. Vaccination as we know it today did not exist, so these diseases spread rapidly through communities. Measles outbreaks often coincided with periods of malnutrition, which weakened immune systems and increased mortality rates. Smallpox could leave survivors scarred or blind, further impacting families already struggling with scarcity and poverty. Ordinary citizens had limited access to medical care, and remedies were often rudimentary, relying on herbal treatments, spiritual interventions, or local healers. The lack of standardized medical knowledge meant that survival often depended on luck, proximity to care, and the ability to maintain basic hygiene. The urban environment of Ottoman cities exacerbated the spread of epidemics. Overcrowded markets, tightly packed housing, and inadequate sanitation created ideal conditions for contagious diseases. Waste disposal systems were primitive, and clean water was not always accessible, allowing pathogens to move easily from one person to another. Pilgrims, traders, and travellers contributed to the transmission of diseases across regions, spreading outbreaks quickly along trade routes and urban centres. Rural areas were not immune, as villages could be affected by returning labourers, travelling merchants, or contaminated food supplies. The empire attempted measures to control outbreaks, though their effectiveness was limited. Quarantines, temporary closures of markets, and restrictions on movement were sometimes enforced during major epidemics. Officials occasionally organised the burning of contaminated buildings, fumigation of streets, or isolation of the sick. However, implementation varied, and enforcement was often difficult in remote areas. Ordinary citizens bore the greatest burden, as they had fewer means to protect themselves or escape infected zones. Social inequalities meant that the elite and officials could often isolate themselves or access better treatment, while the common population suffered higher mortality and more severe disruption to daily life. Epidemics had lasting economic and social consequences. Labour shortages due to illness or death disrupted agriculture, trade, and craft production, intensifying food scarcity and poverty. Families lost breadwinners, children, or elderly members, compounding hardship. Fear of disease influenced social behaviour, gatherings were limited, travel was reduced, and trust within communities could erode as people attempted to avoid infection. Religious and cultural practices also adapted, with prayers, rituals, and festivals often modified to accommodate the threat of illness. For ordinary citizens, epidemics like plague and measles were not abstract dangers. They were immediate, visible, and often fatal. Daily life involved constant vigilance, basic hygiene practices where possible, and coping with fear, illness, and loss. Surviving an outbreak required resilience, adaptation, and sometimes sheer luck. These epidemics underscored the fragility of life in the Ottoman Empire, and highlighted the unequal distribution of safety, resources and care between social classes. In the Ottoman Empire, healthcare infrastructure was limited, leaving ordinary citizens vulnerable to illness, injury and epidemics. Although the empire had some hospitals, known as darushifas, their reach was limited, particularly in rural areas or smaller towns. These hospitals were often located in major cities like Istanbul, Edirne and Cairo, providing services primarily to the urban population or those with access to wealth and influence. For most ordinary citizens, access to professional medical care was rare, and treatment relied on local healers, herbal remedies and traditional practices. The scarcity of trained physicians and limited medical knowledge meant that even treatable conditions could become life-threatening. Hospitals that did exist were generally small, crowded, and equipped with minimal resources. They focused on treating specific illnesses, injuries, or mental health conditions, but patient capacity was limited. During epidemics, these institutions were quickly overwhelmed, unable to accommodate the sheer number of people in need. Ordinary citizens, who often had no means to travel to urban centres or pay for services, were left to fend for themselves. Families attempted to care for the sick at home, but this often exposed more members to contagious diseases, further spreading illness. Medical knowledge in the empire was a mix of traditional practices and early scientific understanding. While some physicians studied the works of Galen, Avicenna, and other classical scholars, their application was inconsistent, and treatments were often rudimentary. Herbal remedies, dietary adjustments, and spiritual interventions were common, reflecting both cultural beliefs and practical limitations. Surgical procedures were performed sparingly due to the risk of infection and lack of sterilization techniques. Ordinary citizens, therefore, relied heavily on trial and error, local wisdom or folk practices, which could be ineffective or even harmful. The lack of widespread medical infrastructure also had serious social consequences. Mortality rates were high, particularly among infants, children, and the elderly. Common illnesses could escalate into fatal conditions due to delayed treatment or insufficient care. Families were acutely aware of the risks of disease and often took preventive measures where possible, such as isolating the sick, avoiding crowded areas, and following local hygiene practices. However, these measures were limited by living conditions, available resources, and cultural norms. Rural areas faced even greater challenges. Villages typically had no formal medical facilities, and local healers or midwives provided the primary care. Remedies were based on knowledge passed down through generations, often blending herbal medicine, superstition, and religious practices. Travel to urban hospitals could be dangerous, expensive, and time-consuming, meaning that most rural residents had little hope of receiving professional treatment. This contributed to a cycle of vulnerability in which ordinary citizens were disproportionately affected by disease, injury, and poor health. The empire did make some attempts to improve medical knowledge and infrastructure. Certain institutions offered training for physicians, and charitable hospitals funded by the state or wealthy patrons aimed to provide care for those in need. Nevertheless, these efforts were unevenly distributed, often concentrating resources in wealthy urban centres while leaving the majority of the population without access to professional health care. Social status played a crucial role in determining who could benefit from these limited services, highlighting the inequality in both treatment and outcomes. Limited medical knowledge and the scarcity of hospitals shaped daily life for ordinary citizens. Illness was a constant concern, and families had to rely on home care, preventative measures, and local remedies to survive. Epidemics, injuries, and chronic diseases could devastate households, disrupt work, and exacerbate poverty. The lack of professional healthcare infrastructure highlighted the fragility of life in the empire, reinforcing the need for resilience, resourcefulness, and community support to navigate illness and maintain survival. The combination of few hospitals and limited medical knowledge underscores how harsh living conditions in the Ottoman Empire affected ordinary citizens. Access to care was unequal, survival depended on adaptability and local knowledge, and disease remained a persistent threat shaping both individual lives and the broader social landscape. In the Ottoman Empire, ordinary citizens faced immense challenges when it came to healthcare, largely due to a severe shortage of medicine and healthcare facilities. While some hospitals, darushifas, and medical centres existed in major cities, their number was limited, and most rural towns and villages had no formal healthcare infrastructure. Medicines were scarce, often expensive, and not always effective, leaving ordinary people vulnerable to disease, infection, and injury. This shortage affected every layer of society, but the poor and working classes suffered disproportionately, as they had neither the means nor the access to secure treatment. Medical facilities in urban centres were primarily concentrated around mosques, charitable endowments, or large hospitals funded by the state or wealthy patrons. These institutions treated patients with available remedies, which included herbal medicine, rudimentary surgical techniques, and religious or spiritual healing practices. Despite these efforts, patient capacity was extremely limited. Hospitals were often overcrowded, especially during epidemics, leaving countless individuals without care. Ordinary citizens who could not travel to these centres had to rely on home remedies, local healers, or community midwives, which were often inconsistent and insufficient to treat serious illnesses. The shortage of medicine further compounded the risks. Essential drugs for common ailments such as fever, infections, or digestive issues were rare, and treatments were often improvised using herbs, roots, and traditional concoctions. The lack of standardization and medical knowledge meant that remedies could vary widely in effectiveness. People frequently used trial and error methods, which sometimes worsened conditions or failed to prevent complications. During epidemics, the scarcity of medicine made it nearly impossible to manage symptoms or contain disease, resulting in higher mortality rates among ordinary citizens. Rural populations were particularly affected. Villages lacked hospitals, trained physicians, or proper pharmacies, and travelling to urban centres was costly and time-consuming. The reliance on local healers or midwives meant that treatments were based on experience rather than scientific understanding, leaving families vulnerable to preventable or easily treatable illnesses. Seasonal illnesses, injuries from labour, and complications from childbirth posed significant threats in communities with limited access to care. Ordinary citizens often faced life-threatening situations that wealthier urban residents could avoid due to better access to medicine and healthcare facilities. The scarcity of medical resources also highlighted social inequalities. Nobles, government officials, and wealthy merchants could afford physicians, medications, and private care, insulating them from the worst effects of illness. Ordinary citizens had to rely on communal knowledge, charity, or local networks for assistance, which was inconsistent and often insufficient. This disparity reinforced social hierarchies, as access to healthcare became a marker of privilege, while poverty and status dictated vulnerability and survival. Furthermore, the shortage of medicine and facilities had long-term effects on public health. Communities suffered from recurring outbreaks, malnutrition-related illnesses, and high infant mortality. Epidemics, such as the plague or smallpox, disproportionately affected the poor due to lack of treatment and preventive care. The inability to effectively respond to health crises created a cycle of vulnerability, weakening populations, limiting productivity, and perpetuating hardship. Families had to plan their lives around illness, rationing scarce resources to care for the sick while maintaining their livelihoods. Despite some attempts by the state to improve medical infrastructure, such as endowing hospitals and training physicians, the sheer size of the empire and the uneven distribution of resources meant that ordinary citizens continued to face significant challenges. Access to medicine and healthcare facilities remained limited, and survival depended largely on local knowledge, community support, and resilience in the face of adversity. The shortage of medicine and healthcare facilities in the Ottoman Empire highlights the harsh realities of daily life for ordinary citizens. With limited resources, inadequate infrastructure, and unequal access to care, illness could quickly become deadly, shaping behaviour, social structures, and the overall vulnerability of the population. Survival required not only physical resilience, but also adaptability and reliance on community networks to navigate the ever-present threats to health and life. In the Ottoman Empire, young men and conscripted labourers often faced gruelling work schedules, particularly during periods of military preparation or large-scale construction projects. Long days spent farming, building infrastructure, or maintaining fortifications were physically demanding and left little time for rest or personal pursuits. For ordinary citizens, these labour-intensive routines were a daily reality, shaping their strength, resilience, and endurance, while also exposing them to exhaustion, injury, and illness. Agricultural work was the backbone of the Ottoman economy, and peasants were expected to contribute significant labour to maintain crops, irrigate fields, and harvest produce. For young men, this often meant working from sunrise to sunset, especially during planting and harvest seasons. The physical demands were immense, tilling land with basic tools, carrying heavy loads, and performing repetitive tasks under harsh weather conditions. These long days were further intensified by the need to provide for the family, while also meeting the obligations imposed by landlords or the state, leaving little room for rest or leisure. Construction work added another layer of hardship. The empire was constantly building and maintaining roads, bridges, aqueducts, and military fortifications. Young men conscripted for these tasks were required to perform physically demanding labour, such as hauling stones, mixing mortar, and erecting structures under the supervision of military or state officials. These projects could last months or even years, often under extreme weather conditions with inadequate tools and minimal protective measures. Fatigue, injuries and exhaustion were common, yet labourers were expected to meet strict quotas and deadlines. The combination of farming and construction labour also had significant health implications. Continuous physical exertion, coupled with insufficient nutrition and exposure to the elements, led to weakened immunity, chronic fatigue, and susceptibility to illness. Injuries were frequent and medical treatment was limited, particularly in rural areas or for ordinary citizens. The demanding work environment made it difficult to recover from illness or injury, perpetuating a cycle of physical strain and vulnerability that defined daily life for many young men in the empire. This labour system also reinforced social and military hierarchies. Nobles and officials rarely performed such physical labour themselves, instead overseeing operations or receiving tribute from those who worked the land. Ordinary citizens, particularly young men, were obligated to contribute to both agricultural production and construction projects as part of their service to the state. In many cases, this labour was tied to military obligations. Those who performed well could later be recruited into the army or assigned to specialised tasks, but failure to meet expectations could result in punishment, fines, or additional duties. The long days of work shaped the rhythm of life for both individuals and communities. Families coordinated schedules around labour requirements, ensuring that crops were tended and construction projects were staffed. Communities developed informal systems of support, sharing knowledge, labour and resources to meet the demands imposed by landlords or officials. Despite these efforts, the physical burden remained relentless, and young men often matured quickly, hardened by the harsh realities of work and survival. The experience of long days of farming and construction also prepared young men for future military service. The physical endurance, discipline, and resilience cultivated through labour-intensive tasks were directly applicable to training, marching, and combat. However, the demands were relentless and unforgiving, leaving little time for personal growth or education outside of work. Ordinary citizens learned early that survival depended on strength, adaptability, and the ability to endure hardship. Ultimately, long days of farming and construction work highlight the intersection of labour, social obligation, and survival in the Ottoman Empire. Ordinary citizens bore the brunt of physical toil, reinforcing social hierarchies, and preparing young men for military service, while simultaneously exposing them to exhaustion, injury, and illness. Life was defined by continuous labour, limited personal freedom, and the constant need for resilience in a demanding and structured society. In the Ottoman Empire, labour for both civilian projects and military preparation was closely supervised by higher authorities, leaving ordinary citizens with very little autonomy. Labourers, including peasants, conscripts, and hired workers, were subject to strict orders from local leaders, military officials, or state-appointed supervisors. These instructions dictated not only what work had to be completed, but also how, when, and under what conditions it should be carried out. Failure to comply could result in punishment, fines, or additional labour, creating an environment of constant oversight and discipline. For agricultural work, local governors or landlords issued directives about planting schedules, harvest quotas, and crop maintenance. Peasants were required to fulfil these obligations regardless of weather conditions, personal circumstances, or family needs. Supervisors monitored performance closely, ensuring that fields were properly tended and output met state and landlord expectations. Any deviation from orders, whether intentional or due to unforeseen circumstances like drought or illness, could lead to severe consequences, including financial penalties, confiscation of property, or forced labour as compensation. Construction projects followed a similar structure. Labourers tasked with building roads, bridges, fortifications, or state buildings were under the watchful eye of officials who demanded precision, efficiency, and obedience. Instructions included exacting details about how materials were to be prepared, the pace of work, and the proper methods for completing each task. Supervisors frequently inspected progress, and workers were expected to meet quotas under the threat of punishment. Mistakes or delays were not tolerated, reinforcing the idea that labourers existed primarily to serve the objectives of the state and its elite authorities. Military conscription further amplified this system of strict control. Young men drafted into service or selected for auxiliary labour were required to follow orders precisely, whether during training, marching, or construction of fortifications. Officers issued commands with little room for discussion, and insubordination was punished swiftly, sometimes brutally. Even routine tasks, such as carrying supplies or performing maintenance, were tightly regimented. The combination of physical labour and strict supervision instilled discipline, but also created immense stress and pressure for ordinary citizens, whose survival often depended on compliance. The enforcement of strict orders was not only practical but also symbolic. It reinforced the hierarchical structure of the Ottoman Empire, emphasizing the power of authorities over common citizens. Labourers were reminded daily of their subordinate status, their dependence on higher-ranking officials, and the consequences of disobedience. Obedience became both a survival strategy and a social expectation, ensuring that work continued efficiently while simultaneously maintaining order and reinforcing social hierarchies. The physical and psychological effects of constant oversight were significant. Labourers endured fatigue from long hours of work while navigating the stress of supervision and potential punishment. Mistakes could lead to humiliation, fines, or additional labour, while success provided only temporary relief. Communities developed coping mechanisms such as sharing knowledge of best practices, supporting one another during particularly grueling tasks, or negotiating minor accommodations with supervisors. Yet the overarching reality remained clear. Labourers were bound by the strict orders of those in power, with little control over their daily lives. The strict enforcement of labour orders also had broader implications for society and military readiness. By ensuring that tasks were completed efficiently and uniformly, the state maintained infrastructure, agricultural productivity, and military preparedness. At the same time, this system perpetuated inequality, as ordinary citizens carried the physical and emotional burden, while elites reaped the benefits of labour. The expectation of absolute compliance created a culture of discipline, resilience, and caution, shaping how ordinary people approached work, authority, and survival. Ultimately, the strict orders from higher authorities for labourers demonstrate the centralised control and hierarchical nature of the Ottoman Empire. Ordinary citizens were expected to obey, without question, endure physical and emotional strain, and contribute to the empire's projects, whether agricultural, infrastructural, or military. Compliance was not optional, but essential for survival, reinforcing social hierarchies and ensuring that the empire could function efficiently while maintaining authority over its population. In the Ottoman Empire, the enforcement of military conscription and labour duties was strict and often harsh, particularly for ordinary citizens. Young men, peasants, and labourers who were drafted or assigned to state projects faced severe punishments if they disobeyed orders or failed to meet expectations. These penalties were designed not only to maintain discipline and efficiency, but also to instill fear and ensure compliance across a large and diverse population. For ordinary citizens, the threat of punishment created a constant tension between survival, obedience, and the grueling demands of daily life. Disobedience could take many forms. Labourers who failed to meet quotas, arrived late, performed tasks incorrectly, or attempted to avoid duty risked physical punishment, fines, or additional labour. Peasants might be whipped or forced to work longer hours in the fields, while urban workers or conscripts could be subjected to public reprimand or imprisonment. The consequences were immediate and often severe, emphasising that the state's authority could not be challenged. These punishments reinforced a culture of vigilance and compliance, as ordinary citizens quickly learned that any lapse in duty could result in serious repercussions. negligence, whether due to exhaustion, illness, or lack of experience, was treated with equal severity. Mistakes during construction projects, farming quotas, or military drills could lead to punitive measures. Supervisors and officers enforced rules rigorously, often prioritising the completion of tasks over individual well-being. Workers who were physically incapable of meeting demands were sometimes subjected to additional labour or public humiliation, further reinforcing the hierarchical power structure. The punishment of negligence ensured that labourers maintained productivity and that military readiness remained uncompromised, even at the cost of personal safety and health. Military recruits faced particularly strict oversight. Young men conscripted into service were expected to follow commands precisely, whether during drilling, marching, or guarding duties. Failure to obey orders, no matter how minor, could result in beatings, confinement, or even corporal punishment. The harsh treatment was intended to instill discipline, resilience, and loyalty, preparing recruits for the rigours of military life. However, it also placed immense psychological and physical strain on ordinary citizens, who were compelled to adapt quickly or suffer consequences. The severity of punishment served a broader social and political purpose. By demonstrating the state's power to punish, authorities reinforced hierarchical control over the population. Ordinary citizens were reminded daily that obedience was not optional, and any attempt to evade responsibilities could result in swift retribution. This system of discipline maintained order, ensured the fulfillment of state projects, and solidified the authority of military and civil leaders. At the same time, it perpetuated a climate of fear, which reinforced social hierarchies and limited personal autonomy. The physical and psychological impact of severe punishments was significant. Labourers and recruits endured exhaustion, injury, and constant anxiety over potential repercussions. Families were indirectly affected as well, as the failure of one member to comply could lead to additional hardship or financial penalties for relatives. Community networks often provided support, offering advice, protection, or assistance to those facing punishment, but ultimately individual survival depended on adherence to orders and avoidance of mistakes. Despite the harshness, the system also fostered resilience and adaptability. Ordinary citizens developed strategies to avoid punishment, such as careful observation of supervisors, sharing knowledge of proper procedures, and maintaining consistent performance under pressure. These coping mechanisms became essential skills for navigating life in the Ottoman Empire, where compliance, efficiency, and vigilance determined both personal survival and the well-being of one's family. Life in the Ottoman Empire was shaped not only by physical hardships, but also by political intrigue, particularly within the royal court. Conspiracies, plots, and betrayals were a constant feature of court life, as ambitious officials, nobles, and family members manoeuvred for power, influence, and favour. For ordinary citizens, awareness of these events might have seemed distant, but the consequences often rippled outward, affecting governance, taxation, and even security in cities and provinces. The unpredictable nature of court politics created an atmosphere of uncertainty and danger that influenced both the elite and the general population. The royal court was a centre of power, wealth, and influence, but it was also rife with internal rivalries. High-ranking officials, viziers, and members of the sultan's family frequently competed for appointments, privileges, or control over strategic regions. Plots to discredit rivals, seize positions, or manipulate decisions were common, and betrayal could be swift and brutal. Execution, exile, or imprisonment were typical outcomes for those caught scheming against the sultan or higher-ranking officials. The volatility of court politics meant that alliances were temporary, trust was rare, and survival required careful navigation of complex relationships. Conspiracies were not limited to ambitious officials, even family members were involved. Succession disputes, particularly in times of transition between sultans, often led to intrigue, imprisonment, or assassination. Princes and their supporters engaged in covert actions to secure the throne, while courtiers aligned themselves with factions they believed would prevail. Such betrayals could destabilize the court, disrupt governance, and create ripple effects across the empire. For citizens, this instability could translate into sudden changes in taxation, enforcement of laws, or even military mobilization, highlighting the indirect but profound impact of court conspiracies on everyday life. The mechanisms of betrayal were varied and sophisticated. False accusations, secret alliances, manipulation of information and bribery were common tactics. Officials employed spies, informants, and intermediaries to gain intelligence, protect their interests, or undermine rivals. For ordinary citizens, these secretive actions could affect their lives in unexpected ways, such as new appointments in local government, sudden tax inspections, or harsh enforcement of previously overlooked regulations. The court's intrigue created an invisible network of influence that reached even the most distant villages and urban neighbourhoods, reminding everyone of the central authority's power and unpredictability. The Sultan himself played a critical role in managing conspiracies. While some rulers relied on personal charisma, intelligence networks, and loyalty tests, others were more prone to paranoia, leading to frequent purges, arrests, or executions. Ordinary citizens had little insight into the inner workings of the palace, but they often bore the consequences of the court's actions. Rebellions, uprisings, or purges initiated at the top could result in military campaigns, conscription, or confiscation of property, directly affecting their security and livelihoods. The atmosphere of betrayal and intrigue also shaped social and political behaviour among elites and administrators. Officials learned to navigate a landscape of suspicion, maintain flexible alliances, and constantly demonstrate loyalty to survive. This culture of vigilance and caution extended downward, influencing local governors, tax collectors, and other intermediaries who interacted with ordinary citizens. As a result, daily life for common people was indirectly affected by a chain of decisions and rivalries originating in the royal court, illustrating the far-reaching consequences of palace conspiracies. In the Ottoman Empire, deception among officials and nobles was a common and often dangerous aspect of life, impacting both governance and the day-to-day experiences of ordinary citizens. Ambitious figures within the court, provincial administrations, and local governance frequently resorted to manipulation, false promises, and secret alliances to secure power, wealth, and influence. These deceptions were not confined to the palace. Their consequences could ripple outward, affecting taxation, legal judgments, and community stability, making the empire's bureaucratic and social systems unpredictable and sometimes treacherous for common people. Officials employed a variety of deceptive tactics to protect or advance their positions. Misreporting revenue, inflating numbers, or falsifying records was not uncommon, particularly when communicating with higher authorities. Governors and local administrators often sought to demonstrate loyalty or competence by exaggerating successes and downplaying failures. This created an environment where trust was limited, and ordinary citizens could be caught in the crossfire, subjected to unfair taxation, arbitrary fines, or enforcement of regulations that were manipulated to benefit the corrupt elite. Nobles engaged in similar strategies to maintain or increase their social standing. Through false claims, strategic marriages, or covert alliances, they maneuvered to secure privileges, estates, or influential posts. Rivalries among nobles sometimes led to public disputes, while other conflicts were carried out quietly through misinformation, bribery, or intrigue. Ordinary citizens had little control over these disputes, yet they were directly affected when local administrators shifted allegiances or reallocated resources in response to noble conflicts. Farms, markets, and villages could suddenly experience increased demands, confiscation, or altered legal oversight, demonstrating how elite deception translated into tangible consequences for the populace. The prevalence of deception also affected the justice system. Judges, tax collectors, and bureaucrats could be swayed by bribes, threats, or personal interest, altering legal outcomes. Cases could be manipulated to favour wealthy or connected individuals, leaving ordinary citizens vulnerable to injustice. Even when laws were clear, enforcement often depended on the whims and loyalties of officials. As a result, citizens had to navigate not only official regulations but also the shifting allegiances, biases, and potential deceit of those in authority, creating a constant atmosphere of uncertainty. Deception among officials and nobles was particularly pronounced during times of political instability or transition. When new sultans ascended the throne, or during periods of military campaigns, ambitious figures exploited the resulting confusion to advance their positions. Ordinary citizens were indirectly affected by these maneuvers. Sudden tax hikes, conscription orders, or changes in local governance were often tied to the shifting strategies of elites seeking to consolidate power. In such a context, survival required vigilance, adaptability, and sometimes a degree of strategic compliance to avoid being caught up in the consequences of elite machinations. The social and psychological effects of pervasive deception were significant. Trust within communities could erode as people observed or experienced the consequences of manipulation firsthand. Cooperation with authorities became a cautious exercise, and citizens learned to navigate relationships carefully, balancing compliance with self-preservation. This environment encouraged resourcefulness, discreet negotiation, and a keen awareness of shifting political dynamics. Ordinary citizens had to understand that the words and actions of officials might not reflect reality, making navigation of daily life both complex and fraught with risk. Despite these challenges, the Ottoman administration also relied on oversight mechanisms to curb extreme abuses. Inspectors, audits, and occasional interventions by higher authorities sought to prevent corruption from undermining the state entirely. However, the empire's size, complexity, and reliance on local officials meant that deception remained a persistent problem, shaping the experiences of ordinary citizens and influencing their interactions with the state. In the Ottoman Empire, disloyalty, whether in the royal court, provincial administration, or among military ranks, was considered a grave offence and was often met with the harshest punishments. Execution and exile were common tools employed by the state to maintain order, deter rebellion, and ensure allegiance to the sultan. For ordinary citizens, these extreme measures reinforced the authority of rulers and officials, creating a climate of fear and highlighting the consequences of defiance or betrayal. The threat of punishment served both as a deterrent and as a stark reminder of the power hierarchy that governed all aspects of life. Disloyalty could take many forms. Courtiers might plot against the sultan or attempt to manipulate succession. Officials could act in their own interest rather than the state's, and military personnel might defect or refuse orders. Even ordinary citizens who participated in revolts, resisted taxation, or supported rebellious factions risked severe consequences. The empire's response was often swift and public, designed to set an example for others. Executions were carried out in conspicuous locations, ensuring that the population witnessed the fate of those who challenged authority. Exile, though less immediately visible, removed potential threats from the political or social sphere and isolated dissenters in distant or harsh regions. Execution was a particularly powerful tool for enforcing loyalty. Individuals accused of treason, conspiracy, or rebellion could face beheading, hanging, or other forms of capital punishment. The method and location of execution were often symbolic, reinforcing the authority of the sultan and the state. By demonstrating the consequences of disloyalty publicly, the empire sent a clear message. Obedience was mandatory, and any challenge to the social or political order would be met with uncompromising force. Ordinary citizens observing these punishments understood that even minor acts of defiance could escalate into fatal consequences. Exile was another common response to perceived disloyalty. Officials, nobles, or military leaders could be removed from the political centre and sent to distant provinces, often under harsh conditions. Exile effectively neutralised threats by separating individuals from their power base, cutting off networks of influence, and limiting the ability to organise rebellion. For ordinary citizens caught in acts of defiance, exile could mean relocation to unfamiliar lands, forced labour, and social isolation. Both execution and exile maintained the empire's strict hierarchical order and reinforced the central authority's control over its population. The use of severe punishment for disloyalty had broader social implications. Communities learned to monitor behaviour closely, report suspicious activity, and comply with official directives. Ordinary citizens were not only aware of the consequences for themselves, but also for their neighbours, families, or associates. The risk of collective punishment or suspicion created a climate where loyalty was essential for survival, shaping social norms and interpersonal relationships. Fear of retribution reinforced obedience and deterred potential conspiracies, strengthening the central authority of the Sultan across the empire. In addition to immediate punishment, these measures maintained political stability. By swiftly addressing threats, the Ottoman state could prevent the rise of factions, limit unrest, and ensure that resources were not diverted toward rebellion. Military campaigns, tax collection, and administrative decisions were less likely to be disrupted when citizens and officials alike understood the severe consequences of disloyalty. The system of punishment, though harsh, was integral to the empire's governance and survival, especially given its vast territorial expanse and diverse population. For ordinary citizens, the constant awareness of potential execution or exile influenced daily life profoundly. Compliance, vigilance, and careful behaviour became necessary skills. People learned to navigate relationships with authorities, avoid political entanglement, and adhere to social expectations, all while managing the challenges of survival, labour, and resource scarcity. The omnipresence of these punishments emphasised the precariousness of life in the empire, where a single act of disloyalty could have irreversible consequences. Ultimately, the practice of punishing disloyalty with execution or exile illustrates the strict enforcement of loyalty in the Ottoman Empire. It reinforced hierarchical authority, deterred rebellion, and ensured compliance across all levels of society. Ordinary citizens had to live under constant awareness of these risks, shaping their behaviour, decisions, and survival strategies while highlighting the pervasive dangers of life in a complex and often unforgiving empire. In the Ottoman Empire, the legal system recognised the diversity of its population, which included Muslims, Christians, Jews, and other religious communities. To maintain social order and accommodate this diversity, the empire implemented special laws known as dhimmi regulations for non-Muslims. These laws governed civil, religious, and social matters, providing a framework for coexistence, while also establishing clear boundaries between Muslim and non-Muslim communities. Ordinary citizens were affected by these rules in multiple ways, shaping daily life, social interactions, and access to resources. Non-Muslims were allowed to practice their religion, maintain their own places of worship, and govern certain personal matters according to their religious law. Christian and Jewish communities, for instance, could manage marriages, inheritance, and family disputes through their religious courts. This system provided a degree of autonomy, allowing minority communities to preserve cultural and religious practices. For ordinary non-Muslim citizens, this meant that while they were part of the broader Ottoman legal system, certain aspects of their daily lives were governed by familiar and traditional rules. However, these special laws also imposed restrictions and obligations that reinforced social hierarchies. Non-Muslims were required to pay the jizya, a tax levied on adult males which symbolised their subordinate status in the empire. Certain public offices and military roles were restricted, limiting social mobility and access to power. Public behaviour was also regulated. Non-Muslims had to distinguish themselves through clothing, signage, or other markers, reinforcing the distinction between communities. Ordinary citizens were thus constantly aware of their position within a stratified society, navigating both legal protections and social limitations. The enforcement of special laws was administered by both Muslim authorities and community leaders. Local officials ensured compliance with taxation, dress codes, and social regulations, while religious leaders oversaw the internal affairs of their communities. Ordinary citizens had to navigate this dual system of authority carefully. Non-compliance could lead to fines, social penalties, or other forms of censure, while adherence provided both protection and a measure of stability in a diverse and complex empire. Special laws also affected economic life. Non-Muslims were often restricted in the types of land they could own, the trades they could practice, and the guilds they could join. While some communities thrived as merchants, artisans, or tax collectors, their opportunities were limited compared to Muslim counterparts. Ordinary citizens had to adapt to these legal and social boundaries, developing skills and networks within the confines of their permitted roles. Economic activity, therefore, was shaped not only by market forces, but also by the legal framework that defined who could participate, and how. Despite these limitations, the system of special laws allowed for coexistence across a vast empire with diverse populations. Non-Muslims had the ability to maintain community cohesion, preserve traditions, and access legal protection for personal matters. For ordinary citizens, this system created a sense of order and predictability in daily life, even while reinforcing hierarchical distinctions and limitations on social mobility. Awareness of these rules shaped interactions, social behaviour, and the strategies communities used to survive and thrive under the Ottoman administration. The dual nature of these laws, providing protection but also imposing restrictions, highlighted the balance the empire sought between inclusion and control. Ordinary non-Muslim citizens had to navigate a complex landscape of privileges and limitations, understanding that their rights and obligations were closely tied to their religious identity. This legal framework shaped social behaviour, economic activity and community organisation, reflecting the empire's approach to managing diversity while maintaining hierarchical order. In the Ottoman Empire, the legal and social framework imposed clear restrictions on the daily lives of non-Muslims and certain social classes, particularly concerning religious practices and clothing. These regulations were part of a broader system designed to maintain the hierarchical order of the empire, reinforcing the authority of Muslim rulers while distinguishing between different religious and social groups. For ordinary citizens, navigating these restrictions was a constant part of daily life, affecting social interactions, economic activity, and personal expression. Non-Muslims, such as Christians and Jews, were allowed to practice their religion, but their rituals and public displays were subject to strict limitations. Worship could take place in designated religious buildings, but the construction of new churches or synagogues often required special permission from the authorities. Processions, public festivals, and other visible expressions of faith were monitored and sometimes restricted, ensuring that they did not challenge the dominance of Islamic practices. For ordinary citizens, this meant that religious life was carefully regulated. Spiritual expression had to occur within socially sanctioned boundaries, blending devotion with compliance. Clothing was another visible marker of distinction. Laws required non-Muslims to wear specific garments or accessories that clearly identified them as members of their religious community. These dress codes reinforced social hierarchies and made public differentiation between Muslims and non-Muslims explicit. Ordinary citizens were compelled to adhere to these rules, which could vary regionally and over time. Failure to comply could result in fines, social censure, or other penalties. Beyond simply marking identity, clothing restrictions served as a daily reminder of social inequality and reinforced the subordinate status of certain groups. These regulations extended to women as well. Women's clothing and appearance were closely monitored within the broader societal framework, particularly for non-Muslims. Restrictions aimed to prevent women from imitating Muslim dress, or appearing in ways that might blur social hierarchies. In addition to clothing, gender norms were reinforced through legal and cultural expectations, limiting mobility, participation in public life, and autonomy. Ordinary citizens, both men and women, had to navigate these rules carefully to avoid conflict with authorities and to ensure their personal safety. Religious restrictions also intersected with economic activity. Certain trades, markets, and guilds were limited based on religious identity, and the requirement to wear distinguishing clothing could affect social interactions and commercial relationships. For example, non-Muslims wearing mandated attire could be recognized immediately, making them subject to differential treatment, taxation, or scrutiny by local officials. Compliance was therefore not only a matter of law, but also of practical survival, influencing how ordinary citizens conducted their work, traded goods, and maintained social networks. The enforcement of these restrictions relied on a combination of state officials, local authorities, and community leaders. Muslim officials oversaw compliance with dress codes and religious regulations, while local non-Muslim leaders often managed internal adherence within their communities. Ordinary citizens had to be aware of both sets of expectations, balancing loyalty to their faith and community with obedience to state-mandated rules. Public punishments for violations, ranging from fines to social humiliation, reinforced the seriousness of these regulations. Despite their limitations, these restrictions also created a sense of identity and cohesion within non-Muslim communities. By defining boundaries, the laws reinforced group solidarity and encouraged the maintenance of distinct cultural and religious traditions. Ordinary citizens navigated these boundaries daily, learning to adapt their behaviour, dress, and practices in ways that preserved both safety and communal identity. In the Ottoman Empire, social hierarchies extended deeply into public life, limiting the participation and rights of ordinary citizens in social events, public gatherings, and communal activities. These restrictions were part of a broader system that reinforced distinctions between nobles, officials, Muslims, non-Muslims, men, women, and commoners. For ordinary citizens, such limitations affected not only social interactions, but also access to resources, networks, and opportunities, shaping everyday life in ways that emphasized inequality and obedience. Participation in public events was closely regulated according to social rank and religious identity. Festivals, ceremonies, and official celebrations were often designed to display the power and prestige of the elite. Nobles and high-ranking officials enjoyed prominent positions, reserved seating, or direct interaction with the sultan or other authorities, while commoners were relegated to peripheral areas or entirely excluded. Ordinary citizens attending such events had to follow strict protocols, demonstrate respect for hierarchy, and avoid behaviour that could be interpreted as insolent or rebellious. Missteps could result in public humiliation, fines, or other punishments, reinforcing the consequences of overstepping social boundaries. Religious identity further influenced access and behaviour in public spaces. Non-Muslims were frequently restricted in how they could participate in communal events, including weddings, religious processions, and market festivals. Dress codes, designated spaces, and limitations on public expressions of faith ensured that minority communities remained visibly distinct and subordinate. Ordinary citizens navigating these rules had to balance adherence to their traditions with compliance to state-mandated hierarchies, often limiting their ability to celebrate freely or assert social presence. Social gatherings, such as markets, guild meetings, and communal work events, were similarly structured along hierarchical lines. Access to resources, information, and trade opportunities was often mediated by social rank. Higher status individuals or guild leaders controlled participation, leaving ordinary citizens with less influence and fewer advantages. Public seating, speaking opportunities, or leadership roles were restricted, reinforcing the idea that social authority and power were concentrated at the top. Ordinary citizens had to navigate these gatherings carefully, building alliances and demonstrating loyalty, while remaining aware of their limited rights. The consequences of violating these limitations could be severe. Displays of disrespect, attempts to assume higher social standing, or unauthorized participation in the elite events were treated as challenges to authority. Punishments range from fines and forced labor to public reprimand or social exclusion. By controlling access and behavior in public spaces, the empire reinforced the social hierarchy and maintained a clear distinction between rulers, elites, and ordinary citizens. The threat of consequence encouraged conformity and ensured that social structures remained stable across the empire's diverse population. Limited social rights also affected personal development and community cohesion. Ordinary citizens had fewer opportunities to influence political or economic decisions through public participation, and their social interactions were often constrained by visibility and proximity to higher status individuals. Community events, while still essential for bonding and cultural practice, had to be conducted within prescribed limits. Citizens developed strategies to navigate these restrictions, such as forming networks, within permitted circles, observing protocol carefully, and negotiating access through intermediaries. These adaptations were crucial for survival, maintaining status, and protecting family or community interests. Despite the limitations, ordinary citizens found ways to maintain cultural identity and social cohesion within the permitted frameworks. Local customs, celebrations within neighbourhoods, and small-scale gatherings allowed communities to preserve traditions and social bonds. However, the broader visibility and influence in the public sphere remained limited, continually reminding citizens of their position in a structured, hierarchical society. Ultimately, the limited social rights in public events and gatherings illustrate how the Ottoman Empire enforced social hierarchies through both law and custom. Ordinary citizens had to navigate a complex web of regulations, social expectations, and visible markers of status. Their daily lives were shaped by these limitations, reinforcing the authority of elites while shaping community interactions, social mobility, and opportunities for participation in the public sphere. Compliance and careful navigation were essential for survival, highlighting the pervasive influence of social rank in every aspect of life under Ottoman rule.